Have you ever been scrolling through the news and seen a headline about some tiny startup raising millions of dollars and just thought, how does a brand new company with maybe just an idea get valued at millions? Well, today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that whole process. We're going to demystify the high stakes world of startup funding from the very first check to that billion-dollar dream.
So here's the plan. First up, we're going to look at the two very different roads a startup can take. It's the first big choice every founder makes. Then we'll start climbing the venture funding ladder, round by round. After that, we'll get into the real price of all that cash. And then we'll break down how those crazy valuations actually work. And finally, we'll talk about maybe the most dangerous part of the whole journey, surviving the gap between funding rounds.
All right, so before we even get to the money, there's a fork in the road. Every single founder has to make a choice about what kind of company they're even trying to build. You can basically put startups into two different baskets. In one basket, you have what you might call a normal business. The goal here is to get profitable, for the founders to stay in control, and to build something sustainable. Think of a fantastic local coffee shop or a successful software business. But in the other basket, you have the rocket ship. The goal isn't profit, it's explosive growth. The whole plan is to burn through cash to grow at a mind-boggling pace, hoping for a massive exit through a sale or an IPO. Now look, both paths are totally valid, but they are playing completely different games. So for the rest of this explainer, we're strapping ourselves into that rocket ship, the one that chases venture capital. Let's move on and see how this rocket ship actually gets its fuel. It's all about climbing something called the venture funding ladder. And let me tell you, it takes a lot of cash to get to the top. And this is where things get a little weird, a little counterintuitive. The whole strategy for these rocket ship startups is to intentionally lose money, sometimes for years and years. You're not trying to be profitable. You're trying to grow at any cost. I mean, think about Amazon in the early days. They weren't making a dime. They were just burning cash to capture the entire market. That's the game, and it needs a constant supply of money from outside investors to work. You see, no investor is just going to write one giant check to take a company from an idea all the way to an IPO. It's just way too risky. So what you do is you raise money in stages, or what they call rounds, as you hit different milestones. It starts with a pre-seed round, then a seed round, then Series A, Series B, and on up the ladder. And what's really interesting is how the rules change at every single step. At the very beginning, in the pre-seed stage, investors are really just betting on the team and the idea. That's it. By the seed round, though, they need to see some proof, some early customers who are actually using your product. For Series A, it's all about numbers. You have to prove your growth is real and your financials are heading in the right direction. And by Series B, you need a convincing story about how you're going to take over the market and what that big payday at the end looks like. Okay, so you're climbing the ladder, you're getting the cash. Sounds great, right? But what's the catch? What's the price you have to pay for all this growth? Well, it comes down to one word: ownership. When you and your co-founders start the company, it's pretty simple. You own the whole thing, the entire pie. 100% of it is yours. But then you need cash to grow, right? So you bring in investors, and they want a piece of that pie in exchange for their money. So you give them a slice, and suddenly your piece of the pie is smaller. That's a concept called dilution. It's not that you have fewer shares, it's that the total number of shares has increased, so your percentage of ownership goes down. And as you keep raising more money round after round, your ownership just keeps shrinking. So here's the kicker. By the time you reach Series B, it's actually pretty common for the founders to own less than 50% of their own company. That means you no longer have majority control. A board, which now includes your investors, can decide your salary, or they can even fire you from the company that you started. This leads to the big question that every single one of these founders has to ask themselves. Is it better to own 100% of a smaller, profitable, million-dollar company, or 20% of a massive, risky, but potentially $500 million business? There's really no right answer. It's just a choice you have to make. So, how do you even figure out how much of the company an investor gets for their money? That brings us to our next section, valuation. This is how you turn an investment into a percentage of ownership. But first, just a quick question to get you thinking. When an investor puts money into a startup, where do their shares actually come from? Does the company create new shares? Are the shares already set aside for them? Or do the founders have to sell some of their own? Take a second to think about it. The answer is A. The company literally creates or issues brand new shares out of thin air just for that investor.
This is a really key concept to understand. Your personal number of shares doesn't go down. What happens is the total number of shares in existence goes up, and that's what dilutes your ownership percentage.
Let's use a really famous example to make this stick. You've probably heard of Peter Thiel, right? He was the very first outside investor in Facebook. He wrote a check to Mark Zuckerberg for $500,000. In return for that cash, he got 10% of the company. On the surface, it's that simple.
So let's do this simple math here. If Thiel's $500,000 bought him 10% of the company, what's the whole company worth? Well, it's worth $5 million. There's a name for this. We call it the post-money valuation, because it's the value of the company after the investor's money is in the bank. And if you work backwards from there, you can figure out the pre-money valuation. All you do is take that $5 million post-money value and subtract the investment. So $5 million minus the $500,000 investment means Facebook was valued at $4.5 million right before Thiel wrote that check. Pre-money and post-money. Those are the two numbers at the heart of every single deal.
All right, you've closed the deal, the money is officially in the bank, time to celebrate, right? Well, not exactly. Now comes what is often the absolute most dangerous part of this whole startup journey, surviving long enough to get to the next funding round. This quote just nails it. One of the biggest reasons these rocket ship startups fail is because they get stuck in this no man's land. They burn through all their cash before they've made enough progress to convince new investors to come in. And like the quote says, nobody wants to pour more money into what looks like a sinking ship. And this brings us to the idea of runway. It's a simple concept. It's just how many months your company can survive before the bank account hits zero. Managing that runway, budgeting it with incredible accuracy, is one of the most stressful but most critical jobs a founder has. So you end up with this constant, high-stakes balancing act. On the one hand, you have to raise enough money to spend aggressively and hit those next huge milestones that will get the next round of investors excited. But on the other hand, you have to leave yourself a cash buffer of several extra months because fundraising always takes way longer than you think it will. Your number one goal is to not get stuck in the middle. And this really brings our whole journey full circle, doesn't it? The venture capital path is incredibly risky. You give up ownership, you give up control, and you're constantly living with a ticking clock. But it is also one of the only ways to build a truly massive billion-dollar company. So we'll leave you with this thought. Is that price, the price of explosive growth, actually worth the reward? That's a question only a founder can answer.